I can predict your entire life with these 5 scores. You were never taught to understand yourself. Every device comes with a manual. Every occupation comes with a job description. But we have never been taught how to understand and use the mind that we've been given. This is my biology lab where I spent every day studying frog samples. On the outside, I was succeeding. I was on track to a secure career. My parents were happy, and I was literally paid to study biology, which is what I was passionate about. And yet, on the inside, I was failing. I was lost. It was about this time that I discovered Jordan Peterson. I trusted him immediately because of his credentials, but also because he was willingly risk his career for what he believed in. He talked about this widely studied personality model called the Big Five Matrix. He described how this model would predict how much money you would make, how long you'd live, how healthy you'd live, and even how successful your marriage would be and what jobs you'd be proficient at. So when he launched his Big Five personality assessment, I was one of the first to purchase it. I finished the assessment in about 20 minutes and I took it outside to read. I read this test under that tree and it changed my life forever. Within a week of that test, I had quit my PhD program, which I had invested 3 years into. I had walked into the recruiter's office and began the process of enlistment. And all this because of the power of that one test. This is my Understand Myself assessment from 6 years ago. The number that scared me into action was my conscientiousness score. This number meant that I would be destined to be unfit, poor, unmarried, and basically end up a loser. According to the psychological literature, it's practically impossible to change these scores. But I was determined to take control of my life no matter what it would take me. It took me 6 years, but I did the actions required to change my C-score, and now I have a personality that can effectively run a business that serves hundreds. In this video, I will share all that I have learned. So what even is personality exactly? It's the frame of reference with which we see the world. This is what we use to categorize threats and opportunities. People use different words for this, things like attitude or mindset or character, but none of these are studied. None of these have a specific definition, and none of these have predictive power. The Big Five Matrix is the only personality model that has predictive power. What this means is if you know the 5 numbers of a person, you can statistically estimate where they would end up. The Big Five has 5 traits, and here are those 5 traits. Let's start with the trait that you recognize, extroversion. We all know people who walk into a classroom and think, so many opportunities, so many stories that I can tell, and so many relationships that I can build. How many people can I speak to? That would be somebody high on extroversion. On the other side, there's of course people who walk into the classroom, don't really want to talk to anybody. They see threats rather than opportunities, would rather go to the back of the classroom, go to the corner, and hope nobody interacts with them. When it comes to conscientiousness, this looks like an army general who's dealing with logistics and personnel and deadlines and enemy movements, and has his handle on everything despite the complexity, and has systems to make order out of the chaos. That's high C. On the other side of the spectrum, low C, this looks like a college student who's always missing deadlines, always late to his classes, finishes his assignments last minute, studies for his exams last minute, and that was me. That was me in grad school. That was me 6 years ago. When it comes to neuroticism, somebody high on neuroticism is thinking of in the mindset of what could go wrong? What's the worst that will happen? And somebody low on neuroticism is thinking, well, what could go right? What's the best case scenario? Now we jump to openness. Openness is the trait of creativity. Think musicians, think artists, entrepreneurs, innovators, inventors, people who are interested in ideas, abstract thoughts in the aesthetic sense. These are folk who want to explore new things. They're interested in fiction, they're interested in stories and movies. And on the other side, we have people who are interested in doing one thing right and the same way every time. Think accountants, bankers, think nurses who have a checklist to follow, doctors, or even surgeons who, you obviously don't want a surgeon trying to be too creative. So jobs which have a checklist and a correct way to do things, those kind of jobs would rank low on openness. Interesting things happen when you have unique combinations of these traits. For example, somebody like Musk, who is a genetic freak, would be very high in openness because he has an aesthetic sense. He's obviously inventive and creative, but he's also extremely high on conscientiousness, which means that he's able to put in the systems and of course the repetitive work required to bring his ideas into fruition. But you don't need to have both of these extreme traits in one person in order to succeed. For example, Apple, one of the most successful companies of all time, was started by Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak. Steve Jobs, extremely open. He was very creative, had a clear sense of aesthetics. However, he had completely lacked conscientiousness to the point that he wouldn't even shower every day. Steve Wozniak, on the other hand, very high in conscientiousness, but maybe not as creative as Steve Jobs. Together, they were the powerhouse that fueled Apple in the early days. Let's do agreeableness. Agreeableness is the trait which measures how compassionate you are, how well you work in teams, and how comfortable others feel around you. On the extreme end of agreeableness, you have folk who sometimes get taken advantage of. On the other side, extremely low agreeableness, you have folk who come off as a dick even if they don't intend to. Women in general are higher on agreeableness than men are. Now here's a very important question. What makes it that there are 5 traits? And who decided what the traits would be? The answer is nobody. No scientist decided that there would be 5 traits. It came out of the data. And I'm going to explain how that happened. Imagine I asked you descriptive questions. How often are you happy? Rate 1 to 5. How often do you smile? Rate 1 to 5. How often do you wake up every day feeling energized and eager to start the day? Rate 1 to 5. Now here's what would happen. If you answer high for question 1, very likely that you answer high for questions 2 and 3. Same way, if you answer low for question 1, you probably answer low for questions 2 and 3, which means that these different questions are linked in some way. Now you might ask a question, well, are these really 3 different questions? Or is this one question asked 3 different ways? And the answer is, if the answers to these questions reliably predict each other, it means that these answers cluster and they reliably reflect something, reflect an underlying reality. And they ask hundreds of descriptive questions to hundreds of people over many, many behavior sets. And what they found was these answers do cluster. And they cluster in 5 separate clusters, which are in fact the 5 traits of the Big 5 matrix. This is why I trust the Big 5 matrix. It was deduced and not theorized. This is unlike other personality matrices like the Myers-Briggs test, which is just made up by Myers and Briggs. They sought the data to validate their assumptions. And here's the curious part. Corporations love the Myers-Briggs test and they hate the Big 5. And that's because the Myers-Briggs test is constructed in such a way that it makes everybody who takes the test feel like a winner. This just does not reflect reality. We know that in real life there are winners and losers, and the Big 5 personality test actually predicts this. That brings us to the very curious question, are some personalities better than others? And we can only answer this with something to judge personalities on, and that's outcomes. Do you believe that some outcomes are better than others? Would you say that earning a high income, having a stable marriage, living a long life, living a healthy life, would you consider these to be good outcomes? If you do, then you're saying that you believe in good personalities, because some personalities mathematically are proven to have a higher likelihood of hitting those good outcomes. But not all traits work the same. For example, you can have a successful career on whichever end of the extroversion spectrum you end up on. For example, a highly extroverted person would absolutely crush it on a sales team. A salesman is expected to be social. He's expected to meet hundreds of people. He's expected to play well in a team. So he needs to be high in extroversion. If he wasn't, then he would be drained and exhausted at the end of the day. On the other hand, a writer would actually be better if he was low in extroversion. Why? Because a writer needs to sit down alone in a room and work on one task for hours on end without companionship, without social reinforcement. So if you wanted to succeed as a writer, you'd almost want to be low in extroversion. And same way with openness. There's no good or bad when it comes to openness. On the high openness side, you see high risk, high reward strategies. What I mean by that is, well, musicians, artists, entrepreneurs, and innovators. How many of these are actually successful? Not a lot. Not a lot of entrepreneurs make it. Not a lot of musicians make it. Very few artists make their first dollar. So, but the ones who do make all the money. So this is where you see winner takes all type of games. On the other side, you have things like accountants. You don't need to be a famous accountant in order to make money. Every accountant has a stable career. So the further you go on the openness spectrum, the less stable your career becomes, but potentially the greater the rewards become. Interesting interplay, which I hinted at before, is if you have high conscientiousness and high openness, you can make some interesting things happen. So quick recap. Some traits like extroversion and openness do not confer a direct advantage one way or other. They're just better for different types of professions. Same with agreeableness. It's hard to say that high or low agreeableness is good or bad. Most people would benefit by being somewhere in the center. But with 2 traits, conscientiousness and neuroticism, there is actually a direction that we want to go towards. Almost everybody benefits by being high in conscientiousness. This is the trait that's tied with income. On the other side, everybody benefits from being lower on neuroticism, because being low on neuroticism predicts lifetime happiness. So quick overview, agreeableness, extroversion and openness, it depends on your goals. There's no good or bad trait when it comes to this. When it comes to conscientiousness and neuroticism, however, there are clear directions that we want to go in, which is why this video is going to be focused on these two traits. But before we talk about that, we have to discuss, well, where do these traits even come from? What determines how you fall on these traits? Are you just born this way? In fact, scientists did twin studies which indicate that 50% of your personality is genetically determined. But here's the thing, this data draws from average people who are not actively trying to seek an advantage in life, are not actively trying to change to pursue goals. So what does this mean? It means people like you or I who are actively seeking to succeed in life, actively seeking to change ourselves to confer ourselves an advantage. We might be able to control way more than 50%. We might be able to control 75% of our personality. The scientific literature indicates that people have these set points which are set in stone and very hard to change. However, wisdom is being able to stretch past these natural inclinations and knowing when to stretch. So going back, where does this personality come from? I already said some of it is genetic, but a huge proportion of it comes from the stories we tell ourselves. And where do these stories come from? These stories come from our experiences. These experiences come from the outcomes that are generated by our actions. So our actions feed outcomes, feed the experiences, feed the stories we tell ourselves, and feeds our personality. But the personality also determines what kind of actions we take in the first place, which means there's this feedback loop. So some people are stuck in a downward spiral where their actions inspire a worse personality, which forces worse actions. And there are those who are on an upward spiral, whose actions improve their personality, and the personality improves their actions. And this is why life has winners and losers, and the Big Five personality matrix predicts this. My journey started when I saw that my conscientiousness score was an 8, single digit. What does this mean exactly? Conscientiousness score is a metric that measures how good you are at making promises to yourself and actually keeping them. What this number meant was that 92% of people were better than me at keeping their word to themselves. And here's what the literature says. C-score, conscientiousness score, is a better predictor of lifetime earnings, which is essentially the money you make, than IQ, creativity, or testosterone. In other words, C-score is more important for earnings than testosterone, IQ, like literally the intelligence, and creative ability. This score indicates that I was not going to make it in modern society. Now here's an interesting question. Why would it be that C-score predicts income even more than IQ? Well, here's the answer. High IQ means that you can probably make good plans, but it says nothing about how well you can follow the plan. You need C-score to actually follow this plan. You can think of this in terms of health. Having a diet plan, even if it's not perfect, but actually sticking to it, is going to provide you better results than having no plan or having a plan and not sticking with it. Have you heard the saying that an insult only stings if it's true? Well, so it was for me. The reason why the score mattered to me so much was not because the score was low, but more so how accurately it reflected my life. I would always promise myself that I would get assignments done on time, that I would be on time for classes, I would be ahead of time in preparations for exams, but it would just never happen. I'd always meet deadlines last minute because I'd be scrolling on my phone, I would be looking at YouTube, I'd be distracted instead of actually putting the work in before time. I would always promise myself that I would go to the gym, that I would eat right, and I would try to look better, become stronger. This just never happened. I had the plan, I had the perfect gym plan. It never materialized. And even when it comes to diet, I had the plan, but it never materialized because I would just go to Chick-fil-A or Panda Express. And when it comes to addictions, I would promise myself, I will no longer watch porn. I will stop after this one last time. I would stop wasting time on video games after this one last session. It just never happened. I would continue to do these behaviors. And every time you make a promise to yourself and you break this promise, you are informing your brain that you are the kind of person who breaks promises to themselves, which is literally what is meant by low C-score. So it was not the score that scared me insofar as it was the fact that I put a number on my bad behavior. It was particularly important because I saw the comparison. I saw that I was in the bottom 8% of society when it came to keeping my word. This is a terrible place to be. This does not reflect where I wanted to be. This personality score alone would make it impossible for me to reach the goals that I wanted to. To be clear, the personality score is downstream of my actions. So I knew that if I changed my actions, I could change the personality score. This would essentially increase my likelihood of being successful in the way that I wanted. I was desperate to change everything, but I couldn't seem to do it. I was stuck in this feedback loop which seems to be self-reinforcing. One of the things which Peterson said struck out to me, which was they studied the US Army and they found that people in the US Army were overwhelmingly high in conscientiousness. So I thought, well, either I would want to be within that group to surround myself by conscientious people and learn from them, or it's a training which makes them high C, which means that I would go through the training. So one of the 5 reasons I joined the US Army was to improve what my personality was. So I had to join the Army and I have those systems imposed on me in order to change. So more than half a year, I made my bed every day, I meditated every day, I journaled every day, I exercised every day, and I was completely divorced from the internet. No internet, no stimulation whatsoever. The most stimulating thing that I could do was journaling. And by doing these actions, unsurprisingly, there was changes in my brain. Now it's true that I had no choice, and the systems were imposed on me rather than me using my willpower to succeed, but it didn't matter. The systems allowed me to change my actions, and this resulted in changing of my personality scores. In other words, you change the inputs, you change the outputs. But to be clear, I'm not saying that you need to join the Army or you should join the Army just to change your personality. There are better ways to do this. And I also mentioned that this was one of the 5 reasons that I joined. What I am saying, however, is you need to take a big irreversible decision in order to actually change your life. Now, this could be an environment change. It could be a location change for sure, but it can also be the social environment, who you surround yourself with. It's easy to understand this by looking at animals. Take the same animal which was a vicious hunter, a powerful beast of the forest, and you put him in a zoo and he can barely even breed. So the question is, in what ways are you in a zoo, socially, informationally, and locationally, and try to change those? You can just change one of these and see a huge benefit. So here's where I started. So what does this say about me? It says I'm low in agreeableness, which was true. I wasn't the best at working in teams, but I was independently minded. Relatively high in extroversion, which means I could do well in groups, but not to a huge extent. Very low in conscientiousness, which was of course the problem. I couldn't hold a plan, I couldn't keep my own word. High in openness, which means I was very interested in the aesthetic sense and creativity. In fact, I'll prove it to you. Check out my jacket. There's only probably one of these on the entire planet. I got this custom made in Italy when I went there last year. And when it comes to neuroticism, I was at a 42, which is not the worst because it's below 50, but it still means that I was in a lot of mental pain. And here's what I did to change this. You already know that I joined the Army in part to change my personality scores. I also worked in a tech startup which sold millions of units of food preservation devices worldwide. Over the past 2 years, I've made 89 videos. This is actually the 90th video. Each of these requires idea generation, organizing these ideas in an orderly way. It requires the actual filming, it requires editing, it requires publishing. It's a complex series of steps which need to be completed 90 times. But the core of all this was I had to make promises to myself and actually keep them, not for days or weeks, but for months and years. And you can do the same. And these are the results. So I retook the test just last year, about 6 years since the initial test, and this is what the results are. Agreeableness is exact same number. Literally 3 both times, 6 years apart. So what does this mean? It means I haven't really changed that much insofar as it comes to interacting with others. Extroversion, 60 to 63. Again, practically the same number. I'm no better at handling crowds and no worse. We leave conscientiousness for suspense. So look at openness. It went from 89 to 98, a bump for sure, which means that maybe I'm more creative and more open to new ideas, more open to the aesthetic sense. When it comes to neuroticism, I went from 42 to 13. So a big dip in the average level of stress that I feel on a day-by-day basis. But conscientiousness, which is where the biggest jump happened, I went from 8 to 90, which is a huge jump. In fact, you could even argue that I haven't changed that much as a person. Most of the stats remain more or less the same. I just became better at holding promises to myself and maybe feeling a little bit less anxious and neurotic on a day-by-day basis. If you're past your early 20s, the window of opportunity to change your personality is shrinking because your brain becomes less plastic as you age. So now is the time that you need to take this personality test. If you don't know where you are, you cannot chart the path to where you want to go. So if you want to know where you are, what's holding you back, and what you need to do to succeed, you need to take the Big 5 personality test. There's a form in the description below. If you fill this and you're qualified, I will pay for you to get this test done. You probably see your peers at work. Some of them, most of them even, are probably disorganized, not really on it, not very conscientiousness, missing deadlines, producing sloppy work. But at the same time, you probably also see guys who are locked in, who are producing high quality work ahead of schedule. But overall, big picture looking at society, it seems that C scores are going down. If you speak to anybody in education, whether it's in college level education or at the high school level, they will all unanimously tell you that something has changed, especially post the pandemic. So what does this mean? There's a golden opportunity. Society will always have a place for high C people. Either you are a valued part of a team in a bigger company or you're running your own business, doesn't matter, C score is always an asset. So what does this mean for you? It means you need to change your actions, not on a short-term basis, not for a week, but for months and years, so that you can move your personality scores and become the kind of person who has the kind of success that you want. This decade is the decade of divergence. You choose whether to sink or swim. C score acts as your life raft, and I'll give you more tactical steps after I discuss N score. If C score will make you, N score will break you. So what is neuroticism exactly? It's a level of stress you face based on the level of threat in the environment. So I'll give you an example. Let's say you're working for a company and there's a rumor floating around of a mass layoff. Should you be worried? Well, maybe you should. But to what extent should you be worried? That's what's determined by neuroticism. Here's an interesting thing. You don't actually get to choose, at least on a short-term basis, how worried you would be. Let's think about the two sides of the spectrum. On the high neuroticism side, you might have one employee who's absolutely freaking out, assumes that they're going to be laid off, already making a catastrophe out of this. On the other side, you have the low-end guy who sees this rumor but doesn't care too much. Either he gets laid off or he doesn't. If he gets laid off, he probably finds something else to do. He's not going to die. So that's why we would rather be on the low side of this than the high side. Like I said before, none of these scores can be changed in the short term. All of this only responds to long-term repeated actions. So first, let's clear the board. Now let's look at a case study of Alex Eagle. Alexander Eagleman is a code name for a member of my community who I've been working with for past 3 months. This is where he started. He started with low agreeableness, relatively high extroversion, low conscientiousness, but still better than where I started. Very high in openness, which makes sense because he's a creative person. He's literally a documentarian, makes documentaries. Very high in neuroticism, which means he's in a lot of mental pain. So what did he do different in the past 3 months to change these scores? He was almost 100% consistent with meditation every single day, journaling every single day, and going to the gym 3 to 4 times a week. But what does this mean in real life? It meant that he was more effective at his job. He needed to produce the first cut of his documentary for a wealthy client. He estimated that he would take at least a month to complete this project, but he actually got it done in 22 days because he actually had the systems and the follow-through to get shit done. After being consistent and showing his brain that he was a man of his word, this is what we saw. The first thing is a small jump in agreeableness, which means that he's probably better at working in teams. Extroversion, also a little bit of a jump, which means that, well, he's more comfortable in groups of people. His openness score was already high, and it's only higher, but this makes sense because he was a creative person who's acting on creative impulses to create creative projects. Then we come to neuroticism. Huge decline from 98 to 24, which means that he's just in a better mental space overall. And of course, the cherry on top is a massive increase in conscientiousness, which means that, well, he is a man of his word. But first, I need to give you a disclaimer. We are using the Big Five matrix in a way that it is not designed to be. The Big Five matrix is not a coaching tool, it is a diagnostic tool. So using it in this way might lead to exaggerations. We don't really know for a fact if the change in conscientiousness is as big as the numbers indicate. My before and after has a 6-year span in between, so it makes sense that a big change could happen. Alex Eagle's before and after have only 3 months span between them, which means that, again, this could be an exaggeration. But what does this mean? It means that at least he went in the right direction. That is not arguable. So if his actions changed and his self-perceptions changed, that means his personality has changed. The key thing to remember is you got to make promises to yourself and actually keep them, do the right actions for long enough. Your personality changes, and that feeds future actions, and that is the only way you have towards the success that you want. But if you feel stuck and you're not able to take these small actions in order to change your personality, it means that you probably need to take a big action. If the small actions aren't doing it, you need to take a big action. And I cannot tell you what this action is. It's just a key core decision that you must make and step across the Rubicon in order to change your life. You can do that for yourself, or you can get my help to do so. So if you think you have low C, or if you think you have high N, You need to start working on that yesterday. Fill out the form in the description below, and if you're qualified, we will pay for you to take this test.